It was supposed to be the perfect road trip. A week off work, a rental car, and my two best friends. We had planned it for months, mapping out our route, booking hotels and sightseeing stops. But nothing could have prepared us for what was about to happen. It was a dark and stormy night, cliché I know, but it's the truth. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was howling. We were driving through a remote area, miles from civilization. The only light was from our headlights, and the occasional flash of lightning. As we were driving along, our GPS suddenly went out. No signal. No connection. We were completely lost. We tried to use our phones, but they had no signal either. We were completely cut off from the outside world. We kept driving, hoping to come across a town or a gas station, but the road seemed to go on forever. It was then that we saw it. A small sign, barely visible in the rain, that read, Motel 5 miles ahead. We were relieved, and made our way towards it. As we got closer, we realized that the motel was in the middle of nowhere. There were no other buildings or homes around it. It looked old and rundown, with broken windows and flickering lights. But we were desperate, so we pulled into the parking lot and made our way to the front desk. The man at the desk was old, with a long white beard and piercing blue eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He gave us a room key, but warned us not to leave the room once we were inside for the night. We didn't think much of it at the time, we were just happy to have a place to stay. The room was even worse than the exterior of the motel. It was small and musty, with peeling wallpaper and a creaky bed. We tried to make the best of it, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As the night went on, things started to get even stranger. We heard strange noises outside the room, like footsteps and whispers. We thought it might just be the wind, but it didn't sound like any wind we had ever heard before. Then, there was a knock at the door. We hesitated, but eventually opened it. There was no one there. We closed the door, but the knocking continued. It was as if someone was knocking on the door from the other side. We were terrified. We tried to call the front desk, but the phone was dead. We were completely cut off from the outside world. We decided to lock the door and wait until morning. But then, the doorknob started to turn. We held our breath as the door slowly creaked open. There was no one there. Just an empty hallway, with the flickering lights casting long shadows. We knew we had to get out of there. We grabbed our things and ran for the car. As we drove away, we saw the old man from the front desk watching us from the window, a smile spreading across his face. We never spoke about that night again. We never went on another road trip together. It was as if that night had torn us apart, and we could never put it back together. But every time I drive through a remote area, in the dark of night, I think about that motel. And I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't made it out alive. When I was younger, me and my family went on a road trip to Wyoming to see Yellowstone National Park. It's a beautiful place, and if you haven't seen it yet, I'd recommend it. Anyways, so from our home in California, it was about a 17-hour drive in our Yukon XL, the largest, most comfortable road trip SUV you can imagine. It took us several days' worth of driving to get there, and during the nights we would try to find a little motel to rest at. One of the nights, due to us being behind schedule, my dad attempted to drive through the night to get us there sooner. He made it probably into the wee hours of the night before he deemed it unsafe and parked us in this little unlit rest stop in the middle of the woods in some flyover state. Me and my brothers had fallen asleep in the car several hours before he'd stopped, so for at least a couple hours we were all sleeping in the car in this dark little parking lot surrounded by forest. Having got a couple hours of sleep and being in a pretty uncomfortable position, I woke up in the middle of the night pretty disoriented but not really scared. I looked around and saw everyone fast asleep in this pitch-black car, and naturally I felt pretty alone. I tried to fall back asleep, but it just wasn't working out, so I just sat there for a while, boredom setting in. I looked out the window to see where we are. It was pitch black, so I couldn't see anything. Luckily, I wasn't the type to pack light and had brought a couple flashlights in my bag. Being careful not to disturb my sleeping family, I reached into the back seat, unzipped my bag, and pulled out a little plastic yellow flashlight. It wasn't the brightest, but it was enough to see the foreground of the general surroundings. I put it up to the glass, making sure not to make any noise, and pushed the little switch into the on position. I pressed my face against the glass and looked out. At first it looked like a normal tree line with some bushes, trees, whatever. But as I scanned the darkness, looking for animals, buildings, etc., I noticed this dark shape standing between these two trees in the distance. It looked like the shape of a man, but it wasn't moving. Just sitting there. After watching it for a good while and seeing no real signs of movement, I just assumed it was a bush or some kind of natural occurrence. Just as I was about to turn the light off and reattempt sleep, I saw this shadow shape turn 90 degrees and move behind a tree, disappearing from sight. This scared the heck out of me, and I immediately turned off the flashlight and threw my sweater-turned blanket over my head, shutting my eyes tightly and covering my ears. I was paralyzed with fear and too full of adrenaline to get any sleep, sat in this semi-fetal position, clutching my flashlight, for the rest of the night. I waited until the sun came up and we were back on the road before I got any sleep. I didn't tell anybody about the man I saw in the woods. I'm from Connecticut. I was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from Georgia, and would often make road trips down to visit her. I don't really mind. I love road trips. I've driven across the United States and back, all on my own. There's just something about traveling the highways of the US by yourself that's just so freeing. To save money, I would sleep in my car. It's not so bad, it's basically camping, in a metal tent. Makes you feel like you're really roughing it. I just recline the seat back, keep the key in the ignition just in case, and doze off. No, I don't put anything up to block the windows for privacy. Maybe I should've. The trip down south is a comfortable 2-day drive. My stop would usually be somewhere along the Virginia-North Carolina border. So, for my previous trip, that's exactly where I stopped that night. Rest stops were often less trafficked and thus quieter than truck stops. Normally I would have stopped at a Love's, but I was so tired that I settled for the first rest stop I saw. It was oddly vacant that night, with only a couple lone cars sitting under the amber street lamps. Most likely travelers with the same idea as myself. I pulled into a parking spot away from the others, under the shadow of a tree and far from the street lamps. I figured I would have more privacy there as opposed to being bathed in light. So I did my usual thing, locked my doors, opened the window just a hair for ventilation, kept my key in, reclined the seat, and went to sleep. I was never interrupted on any of these car camping nights, so I never suspected anything on this one. Then a sharp tap woke me up. At first, I thought I had heard it in my dream. I opened my eyes, a bit confused. Since I was leaned back, I was facing the ceiling and couldn't see anything. I heard another tap, like a tiny object hitting a hard surface. It came in an irregular rhythm. Was it raining? Was water dripping onto my windshield? I'm under a tree. Maybe something fell from the branches. Maybe a squirrel or a bird dropped something. What if a squirrel was climbing around my car? Or what if it wasn't an animal? The thought occurred to me that it might very well be a person poking around outside. What did they want? Were the doors locked? Yes. The keys were in the ignition. I can leave in an instant. Still, I lay there, completely still, pretending to be asleep. Pretending I hadn't heard anything. Hoping whoever it was, they would leave me alone. It was better to not find out. I was too afraid to find out. It was better to stay here in blissful ignorance. Still the tapping continued. I had to do something. There was no way I was just going to stay there. I had to look. My heart was pounding. In that moment, it was deafeningly loud. Whoever was out there could probably hear it. I decided I was going to look. I was going to raise my head up and see what was making the noise. So that's what I did. What met my eyes sent a jolt through my entire body. Every muscle fiber locked up in pure shock at what I saw. The faint glow of the street lamps cast just enough light for me to make out what I was looking at. There in the windshield, staring directly at me, was a face. Someone, I presumed to be a woman, was lying on my hood, her face pressed right up against my windshield. Her face was completely still, locked in a permanent grin. I froze in overwhelming terror. The eyes I stared into appeared to have rolled back, showing only the whites. The nose was turned up, pressed painfully into the glass. The lips stretched wide, revealing horrid rotten teeth. Even in the darkness, I could tell her skin was sickly pale, contrasting her long, filthy black hair. Whoever this was, she was clearly not in her right mind. I don't know how long I sat there, too afraid to move. Finally, I got a grip on myself and shot my hand to the ignition. It turned over, making, in that instant, the most beautiful sound I ever heard. For a split second, I was afraid I might be caught in a horror movie scenario, the one where the car won't crank as the killer approaches. I reversed as fast as I could, trying not to give this creeper time to try anything. In my panic, I remember activating the windshield wipers in a futile attempt to get her off. I thought, was I about to drive out of here with some wacko holding onto my hood? Thankfully, I didn't have to worry about that, because as soon as I stopped, the woman leapt off, landing on all fours. Seeing my opportunity, I shifted into drive and gunned it, right as I saw her reaching for the driver's side door. With my foot on the gas, I sped out of the parking lot. Behind me, I heard her let out a piercing shriek like that of an animal. I looked in my rearview mirror, and for a split second I thought I saw her chasing me, running on all fours, her black hair swinging wildly around her. I couldn't get a good look as I rounded a curve in the road leading out of the rest stop and merged with the highway. There, I picked up speed and drove through the night. I did not dare stop again until I saw the morning light.